Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone for coming. It's just wonderful to see so many people here. I have friends, old and new. I have colleagues. I've got people I know, people I don't know, but it's just wonderful to see everyone. So thank you very much. And yes, I'll be talking on the curious history of curiosity-driven research. And I'm going to start with Peter Medawar, who's, of course, one of the three people after whom this prize is named. And he wrote a book called Advice to a Young Scientist, where he noted the benefits of being awarded a prize. The effects, he said, were a great moral boost that came from such an expression of the confidence and esteem of others. This, in turn, he thought would assist their research and perhaps, to quote him, help them do better than before. Very likely, too, he said, the prize winner will want to show everyone that it wasn't a fluke. I certainly agree with the positive vibe, and I hope you'll find this lecture interesting, enough to convince you that the award was not down to luck alone. So in this lecture, I'm going to be curious about curiosity. I'm going to ask the question why about asking why. Because curiosity has got an important, perhaps central role in the stories we tell about science in public and how science contributes to the public good. Now, I think I first noticed this when I was reading the words of scientists who've won Nobel Prizes. These statements come from a variety of modes of public communication, from interviews to Nobel banquet speeches, but there's a common thread. Time and time, there was mention of curiosity. So, for example, the Japanese molecular biologist Yoshinori Ohsumi, who won the 2016 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on how cells eat themselves. Now, a colleague of his, was reported in Nature, said, Ohsumi never overlooks anything, even in the most banal kind of experiment. He doesn't care about whether it will lead to something useful, whether a breakthrough can be expected, whether it will lead to more funding. He just follows his curiosity. Australian-born 1975 chemistry Nobelist John Cornforth attributed his prize to a lifelong curiosity about the shapes and changes in shapes of entities that we shall never see, and a lifelong conviction that this curiosity will lead to the truth about chemical processes, including the processes of life. The Italian physicist Carlo Rubbia, leader of the team that found the W and Z particles, and who received a Nobel in 1984, spoke of the work of his great European laboratory at CERN in the following terms. What is fundamental? It is based on curiosity. All these scientific achievements are driven by curiosity. Curiosity, by their own testimony, leads scientists into science. The American Philip Sharp of MIT, Nobel Prize winner for Physiology or Medicine in 1993, co-founder of Biogen, remembers, and I quote, "It was a step driven by curiosity. I clearly did not want to spend my life being a farmer. I enjoyed the life when I was young, but it was not very intellectually stimulating, and the world was very confined. Science gave me the opportunity to continue learning through curiosity." The German Christiane Nuschlein-Volhard, Physiology or Medicine, 1995, on the genetic control of embryonic development, when asked, "What drove you into science?" answered, I quote, "I think a very big curiosity. I am very curious, and I like to understand things. And not only science, I try to find out why and how things work. Science and nature caught my eye." Indeed, our very own Royal Society President, Sir Venki Ramakrishnan, Chemistry 2009, said in his Nobel biography, "People go into science out of curiosity, not to win an award." Now, within that talk of curiosity, there's another structural theme. Curiosity in science is often linked to curiosity in children. The British radio astronomer Anthony Hewish, Physics 1974 for aperture synthesis and pulsars, said in his interview, "From the earliest days I was taking things apart and usually breaking them. I just wanted to know how things worked. The only real way to do that is to get inside them. The curiosity was always there, I think. I don't know. It certainly didn't come from my family, because my father was a banker. I was just a curious child. I just wanted to know how things worked." Or take Maurice Wilkins, one of the trio in whose name we are here today. He won a share of the DNA structure Nobel. His parents, say the authors of his Royal Society biographical memoir, I quote, "encouraged technical curiosity and were well enough to support him quite early on with a garden workshop equipped to support lens grinding for ambitious telescopes and for the construction of quite sophisticated model aeroplanes that could fly." That's what he wanted in an aeroplane. Likewise, the American George Smoot, Physics 2006 for the cosmic microwave background radiation and isotropy, said, "My parents respected education very much. They were both technically orientated. I think, in one sense, I have never grown up. I kept indulging my curiosity. I keep wanting to know how the universe works." So there's a significant variant of this emphasis on the curious child, and it's that formal education discourages the innate curiosity of the child, and the scientist is the child who survived. For example, Leon Lederman, here he is, as adult and child. He was director of Fermilab, one of the great particle physics laboratories in the United States. He won a Nobel Prize for his work on neutrinos. He said, "Children are born scientists. They do everything scientists do. They test how strong things are. They measure falling bodies. They learn the physics of the world around them. They are all perfect scientists. They ask questions. They drive their parents crazy with why. And then somehow they go to school, and the school system crushes their curiosity and converts them to timidity and fear of science." Well, here's the cosmologist Hermann Bondi, who begins a review of Freeman Dyson's book, The Disturbing the Universe, with an unsolicited and remarkable provocation that leads to the statement that curiosity must indeed be the mainspring of scientific endeavour. And I quote, "Occasionally I feel unkind towards my many friends and colleagues in the education industry by pointing out that every small child makes a nuisance of itself by constantly asking why. That society has developed a marvellous defence mechanism called education, and that this is so effective that it stops almost everyone from keeping on with this questioning. The few failures of this cure are, Bondi claimed, called scientists." Now, the source, or indeed apotheosis, I use the word advisedly as the elevation to divine status of this theme, can be found in self-fashioning of the preeminent figure of modern science, Albert Einstein. Age 67, writing for the Library of Living Philosophers at the invitation of the editor Paul Arthur Shilp, Einstein spoke, "It's a miracle that curiosity survives formal education. It is, in fact, nothing short of a miracle that the modern methods of instruction have not entirely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry." Now, that line, the holy curiosity of inquiry, is repeated also in Einstein's very last interview with Life magazine's William Miller. It's in this article here. It's called Death of a Genius. The subtitle is His Fourth Dimension Time Overtakes Einstein. And sandwiched between adverts for carpet cleaners and, ironically, Halo shampoo products, this intimate glimpse has Miller, the Life journalist, turning up at Einstein's doorstep with Miller's son called Pat and an intermediary, Professor William Hermanns. And if we go to the important part of this interview and just have a read, Einstein looks at Pat and simply asks, "Does not the question of the undulation of light arouse your curiosity?" "Yes, very much," said the boy, his interest brightening. "Is this not enough to occupy your whole curiosity for a lifetime?" "Why, yes," said Pat, smiling rather sheepishly. "I guess it is." "Then do not stop to think," said Einstein, "about the reasons for what you are doing, about why you're questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existence. One cannot help but to be in awe when you contemplate the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvellous structure of reality. It is enough if one merely tries to comprehend a little of this mystery every day. Never lose a holy curiosity." Now, those sort of aphorisms, they're still circulating today in the radically decontextualized genre of the internet meme. There's clearly an important contemporary appetite for repeating this view of curiosity. But let us pause. Let's pause to be curious about this modern formation of curiosity, its identification with the child, with the suggestion that curiosity is innate, a stable and natural and universal given capacity, and of the scientist as the adult, as the grown-up child who remained curious despite formal education. So Einstein said curiosity had its own reason for existence. Well, maybe. But there are other reasons too, and we should stop to think about them. Curiosity has not always been the same. Curiosity is a historical formation that has historical reasons to exist at different times and at different places. Ambiguity characterises curiosity in all its manifestations throughout the early modern period, says Barbara Benedict in her Cultural History of Curiosity from the 16th, the 18th centuries. Now, early modern curiosity is different. It's a source of both truth and error. It's a sign of the free intellect, but it's also the stigma of corruption. So it has both positive and negative connotations. And that notion's warranted by the Bible. If we think of Eve and the apple, for example, the curiosity is a mark of discontent, something that betrayed the desire to know or possess more than was given by God's providence. Curiosity was sinful. It's the lust of the mind, said Thomas Hobbes. Curiosity is vanity, said Blaise Pascal. And I've memified these two sentiments, ready to share. Cabinets of curiosity, those private individual museums of the extraordinary that flourished in the intellectual culture of early modern Europe, may be to our modern eyes delightful collections of the exotic and the strange, but they're also potentially dangerous. Who, after all, was doing the classifying. What objects were possessed in private? What secrets were being pried into? Were they an expression of the sin of pride? However, Francis Bacon, in the Advancement of Learning of 1603, passionately contradicted the theological prohibition against curiosity as the original temptation and sin. And as Barbara Benedict puts it, from the Restoration onwards, from 1660 to the 19th century, curiosity rose to a peak of frenzied attention as scientists, journalists, women, critics, collectors, parvenu middle-class consumers and social reformers asked questions that challenged the status quo. In his Baconian History of the Royal Society of 1667, Thomas Sprat, the author, wrote, "It is strange that we are not able to inculcate into the minds of many men the necessity of that distinction of Lord Bacon's, that there ought to be experiments of light as well as of fruit." People always say, what solid good will come from them, particularly from the experiments of light, right? But they should know that in so large and so various an art of experiments, there are many degrees of usefulness. Some may serve for real and plain benefit without much delight, some for teaching without apparent profit, some for light now and for use hereafter, some for ornament and curiosity. If they persist in condemning all experiments except those that bring them immediate gain and a present harvest, they may as well cavil at the providence of God, that he has not made all the seasons of the year to be times of mowing, reaping, and vintage. In other words, some experimental knowledge might be useful now. These are the experiments of fruit, but some perhaps apparently ornamental or motivated by curiosity are the experiments of light, while they might, probably will be, useful later. Now that spectrum of research, as defended by Sprat, which made curiosity as justified a reason as utility, has therefore been part of science's rhetorical armoury for some time. Now, we can find Sprat's quotation, reproduced in full in Peter Medawar's Advice to a Young Scientist, published in 1979. Now, Medawar, of course, is the third of the names of Wilkins-Bernal-Medawar. He was an immunologist. He did work on skin grafts, both practical work but also theoretical work in immunology. But he was also an accomplished and witty public speaker and public scientist. He presented, for example, the Wreath Lectures in 1959. And it's that public context, of course, that lends his name to these lectures. Now, in Advice to a Young Scientist, where Medawar is discussing the reasons for going into science, he's strikingly dismissive. Here's Medawar, here's the book. He's strikingly dismissive of the idea of curiosity being a sole cause for the sciences. Conventional wisdom has always had, to quote him, that curiosity is the mainspring of a scientist's work. But that, to him, has always seemed an inadequate motive to me. Curiosity is a nursery word, he said. But the context in which he presents the Sprat quotation, the defence of the experiments of light as well as the experiments of fruit, is really quite significant and is a clue of, I think, how to think historically about curiosity and curiosity-driven research in particular. What happens is he's in the middle of a discussion of types of science, between basic science and applied science. He notes the snobism that is sometimes directed towards applied science. He then goes on to talk about something that had happened quite recently in science policy, which was the introduction of the what was called the customer contractor principle, which was a suggestion, a plan that came from Lord Rothschild that entered into British science policy, and it was all about matching up what the departments wanted with what laboratories could contract to do. And what's interesting about it is that it introduces a market language into science policy in a very strong way. Medawar writes that the most sinister consequence of looking down on applied science was a backlash that diminished pure science in favour of its practical applications, and that culminated in England in the injudicious advocacy that sought to fund research on the basis of the retail trade, he says, the so-called customer-contractor principle. And then Medawar cites Spratt, with it the authority of the Royal Society in support of the necessity of experiments of light, of pure science and of curiosity. And that conjunction is a clue. It makes us think that perhaps the modern history of curiosity in general and curiosity-driven research in particular lies in the politics of making distinctions between categories of science. And that's where historians can help. So categories such as pure science and applied science or curiosity-driven science, they're not natural kinds, right? They don't just exist. They are inventions. They are powerful rhetorical tools forged by people for particular reasons. Now, historians have in recent years done excellent work scrutinising the histories of such categories. So I'm thinking of Robert Budd, it's there I think, and Graham Gooday, back there, on applied science, of David Edgerton on defence research, on him and Sally Horrocks on industrial research, Sabine Clark on fundamental research, Benoit Godin on the concept of innovation. So we've begun to map out the histories of these terms and why they've been used. And each of those histories is fascinating. I'm to take innovation, for example. Just like curiosity, innovation was once deeply ambivalent. And during the Reformation, it took on a particularly negative common meaning. So to say something was an innovation was bad, right? Innovation was dangerous, upsetting, unwanted. Only very recently, in the 19th or even the 20th century, has innovation become attached to technologies or assumed its familiar positive sense. In early modern times, a university innovation hub would have been quickly burnt to the ground. But the histories of pure and applied science are most relevant here. If we take Britain as our case study, the 19th century witnessed a sustained campaign by what the historian Frank Turner called public scientists. And what they wanted a substantial public, ultimately state endowment for science, alongside improved professional status, resources and respect. And it's in that context that a distinctive Victorian and Edwardian social contract for science is hammered home. One in which the autonomy of pure science was promoted in return for eventual longer-term practical returns. Terms such as fundamental science or fundamental research were invented as part of the finessing of that deal, as Sabine Clark has shown. Now, that contract, I see that contract as making historical sense in the context of a world where problems are constantly being articulated. The incessant pressure to respond to the immediate problems of the clinic, the farmer, the factory, the army, the navy. These are what I call working worlds. This is a concept that I devised and found helpful in my survey of 20th century science. And it's precisely the pressure, that incessant pressure of demands of solving problems that encourages a separatist language of purity. And it's there that we find the stirrings of a reawakened notion of curiosity-driven research. It's in the 1920s and 1930s where you can start seeing it. It's a minor synonym for pure science. So you begin to find directors of research stations being praised because they, even though they are working towards practical problem solving, they are nevertheless praised for preserving the free pursuit of research impelled by investigators' curiosity. So you can resolve that paradox. You know, why is it free research, but you're also directly related to solving problems? When you notice that the language is defensive and rhetorical, it's something not necessarily to be accepted on face value. Now, one person who proposed to modify quite radically the social contract, and is the exception that proves the rule really, was the X-ray crystallographer and socialist Jon Bernal. That's the third of our trio. In the 1930s, Bernal argued that science was so functionally important for solving the world's problems that it must be guided by the state. This is Bernal's map of science. All the scientific disciplines are at the top, the applied sciences are in the middle there somewhere, and at the bottom, though you can't read them, are problems that need to be solved. And we can zoom in and just get a sense of one of them. So, for example, biochemistry is a discipline, specialty in the sciences. It can be applied to problems of food preservation as a sort of applied science, and that's coming from the problems of cookery and food supply. Right? So Bernal directly links the worlds of problems with the worlds of the sciences. And he's doing so, and he's arguing with people such as Thomas Henry Huxley of the previous generation or so, who had insisted on the ideals of pure science, the idea that, to quote Huxley, that the history of the sciences teaches that practical advantages, even though they might be attainable through the agency of science, will never be sufficiently attractive to the men of science to encourage them to undergo the toils necessary to serve science. Bernal is having nothing of that. Here's Bernal. That scientific research is profoundly satisfying to all who choose to undertake it is undeniable. The growth of the profession of science to its present dimensions is not a sign of a spontaneous increase in the number of individuals with natural curiosity, but of the realization of the value that science can bring to those who finance it. For those purposes, the psychologically pre-existing natural curiosity is utilized. Science uses curiosity, it needs curiosity, but curiosity did not make science, says Bernal. Indeed, Bernal goes on, whatever scientists may think, there is no economic system which is willing to pay scientists just to amuse themselves, just to follow their curiosity. The idea that scientists merely satisfy a psychological aim, the satisfaction of curiosity, was for Bernal naive. Instead, under socialism, science should be planned to solve problems, in his words, in the service of man. Now, Bernal points at curiosity as a psychological aim. And as an aside, it might be worth thinking about what is the discipline of psychology doing with this question of curiosity. Well, William James in the 1890s had made passing comments on curiosity. He distinguishes between a common curiosity, which is a biological function that we share, and a scientific curiosity, which for James, William James, he called it a form of metaphysical wonder, which, to quote him, the practical instinctive root probably has got nothing to do with common curiosity. It's what the philosophical brain does when confronted with inconsistencies or gaps in the knowledge. Now, that was William James in the 1890s. The moment when curiosity becomes an important psychological subject is in the mid-20th century. And the leader of that research was Daniel Berline. Now, he was born in Salford. He was educated at Manchester Grammar School, then progressed to Cambridge, then to Yale, where he did a PhD, on curiosity as a psychological topic. He was forced to return to Britain for visa issues and spent some time writing up his results at Aberdeen University before returning across the Atlantic. Berlin published his paper, A Theory of Human Curiosity, in 1954, whilst living in Aberdeen, and that's followed in 1966 by a paper called Curiosity and Exploration, which is the most cited piece of scientific work on curiosity. In there, Berlin argues that incongruity, surprisingness, and complexity were the three distinguishable and measurable factors that prompted curiosity in animals, including humans. So this is Berlin's test for infants. He watches to see where the infant's eyes move towards. Is it the more complex shape or is it the simpler shape? For higher animals, he identified a capacity of epistemic curiosity, in which all those factors play out in dissonances of knowledge. So to investigate curiosity in adults, Berlin read questions about animals. So he'd give you a surprising question like, do rabbits have wheels? And they would incite more curiosity than non-surprising questions. And the questions had visual analogues as well, as we can see. So Berlin also conducted an experiment where subjects were presented with quotations, each followed by the names of 2 or 3 possible authors. Each author's name was coupled with a number purporting to show how many teachers out of a group of 100 had guessed it to be the correct name. So Berlin also predicted the early evening game show Pointless. Now, I can't look at a rabbit car without thinking of duck rabbits. Now, this famous Gestalt image in which we switch from seeing a duck and a rabbit, used by Ludwig Wittgenstein, and then in my field, History of Science, by Thomas Kuhn in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions of 1962, contemporary of Berlin's work. Now, Kuhn's model of science, in which in normal periods scientists are constrained by the assumptions of the paradigm, is one in which curiosity is strictly delimited. It's science as problem-solving, but also in a highly constrained way. There's none of the openness to the wider problems of the world that we see in Bernal, or for that matter, my working worlds model. Okay. That's enough psychology. Let's return in the final stretch of this talk to just tracing out the recent history of curiosity-driven research. In 1968, the US National Science Foundation published the result of Project Traces, Technology in Retrospect and Critical Events in Science. That was in response to a Department of Defense report that said that basic research had minimal influence. So what the NSF had done was turn to history of science to justify the importance of basic science. And their method was to examine the chain of research that led into 5 major innovations and to see which of those were mission-oriented and which were not, which were pure curiosity-driven. So that's an example of one of the maps they drew. It's for the electron microscope, and each of those red dots is a moment of non-mission-oriented science, of pure science, of curiosity. The blue triangles, which are fewer in numbers, you can see, those are the mission-oriented sites. And the overall message you were meant to get from this was that look how important basic research is, of how important curiosity-driven research was. We can zoom in, we can see in particular things like, there's a zooming into the last picture, we can see there in the centre Max Planck developing the quantum theory of light as a step towards the electron microscope. Now, a couple of quick comments. First of all, we know from very good historical work, from David Cahan's history of the German Standards Laboratory in Berlin, that Planck's quantum theory was developed to make sense of data generated by that laboratory in order to solve the problems of the German electrical light and power industries. Quantum theory was partly a response to the working world of industry. And it has to be framed in certain deliberate ways to be cast as the red dots, as non-mission or pure science. Second comment. In Britain, directly similar parallel work to Project Traces was underway, and it began to deepen the concept of curiosity-driven research. So in the late 1960s, the UK government's Council for Scientific Policy launched a major investigation that sought to quantify the economic benefits of scientific research. So two scientific civil servants, the economist Ian Byatt and A.V. Cohen, devised a quantified model that sought to capture the economic benefits of science, but in particular, to quote them, to measure and predict a major, hitherto unquantified benefit, namely the long-term economic benefit of curiosity-oriented research. Byatt and Cohen test their model. They use quantum theory again. They also instigate a substantial follow-up program that involves Fred Jevons and team at the University of Manchester, Chris Freeman at Sprue in Sussex, and the system modelers of the Atomic Energy Authority, and each of those produce papers and publications. And that's the emerging academic science policy pioneers being enrolled into this research. Byatt and Cohen concluded that pure research, including curiosity-oriented research, tends to give rise to major industries in about one generation. But there are problems. The Manchester group recoiled. They argued that science-technology relations were normally too complex to lend themselves to this method. It's rarely possible to pinpoint scientific curiosity from which wealth-producing applications are derived. The Atomic Energy Authority modelers also ran into problems. They complained that it was just too difficult. You'd require, and I quote, a great expertise in history of science to do this properly. It's good. We might also remember that Byatt and Cohen's case study, Planck's quantum mechanics, is not a simple case of curiosity-driven research. The point is that this work of the late 60s and early 1970s, which is the most substantial attempt to investigate theoretically and empirically the contribution of curiosity to science and to its economic impact, work which drew on the resources of the state and the most vigorous academic centres of the day, foundered. The facts of curiosity's contribution remained uncertain, and in the absence of certainty, what can be said? Now, the 1970s language of curiosity-oriented research, the blue line, was replaced in the 1980s by closely connected curiosity-driven research. This is a Google Ngram. It's very fun. You can trace out the frequency of phrases and words in a huge corpus of documents. You get a sense of how do certain terms rise and fall and as they are used. And you can see there's a sharp spike, right, going from the 1980s. And in the context of that sharp spike has been the focus of my most recent historical research. What I'm doing is I'm exploring science and science policy under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, now that we can, for the first time, trace those discussions, arguments and events through the primary sources that are being released at the National Archives. We get a fresh, new sense of what all those arguments were about. Now, science, the recipient of generous state funds and the potential source of innovations and new industries, is a recurrent policy matter for Thatcher, given her radical programme of the transformation of Britain. And it's given extra piquancy by the fact of her training and experience as a working scientist. Indeed, soon after entering number 10 in 1979, she reserved the right to and responsibility to speak on science policy for herself, citing her own expertise. She sought and commented directly on scientific advice. Here, for example, is the list of atmospheric chemistry equations that she requested for her own inspection in 1984. These are the blue pen marks that shows her exactly what she's reading here about particle physics. And what's becoming clear is that there is a radical, sharp shift in science policy around 1987. There we find a crystallisation of policy as government funding for near-market research was abruptly curtailed under the argument that private industry should step up. And to balance that, the science base, especially what becomes defined and talked about as curiosity-driven research, was heralded. Now, the details of that history are convoluted, but the proximate steps towards it are as follows. In 1987, the eminent molecular biologist Max Perutz writes this article for the New Scientist. It's called How to Stifle Innovation. And he's very angry. He's angry about a proposal that's coming forward that is offering far more planning in the sciences. And he attacks it. And the attack gets a warm response from the advisors around Margaret Thatcher. Robin Nicholson in the earlier period, John Fairclough and George Guy's in the later period, the crucial period. Because it suggests a way of legitimating the curtailing of near-market research. Thatcher herself reads the Perutz article. We can tell by the blue ink. We can tell by the initials MT there as well. Perutz here attacks mission-oriented science. He gives a list of great innovations, stating that they all arose from basic curiosity-motivated research. George Guy's urged Thatcher, this was the right approach to science policy. Even Silicon Valley, Guy's wrote, implausibly, was the result of curiosity-driven research. Now, the Thatcher's new policy was fully expressed in her famous Royal Society speech of the 27th of September 1988. Now, her speech is usually remembered as a call to arms to act on anthropogenic climate change. That was another abrupt change for Margaret Thatcher. Earlier, she had been a sceptic. But the other important element of that speech, which is perhaps one of the most important science policy speeches of the last few decades from a politician, was on curiosity. Of course, I can't do her voice, of course, the nation as a whole must support the discovery of basic scientific knowledge through government finance. But there are difficult choices, and I should like to make a few points. First, although basic science can have colossal economic rewards, they are totally unpredictable, and therefore the rewards cannot be judged by immediate results. Nevertheless, the value of Faraday's work, is always her favourite example, must be higher than the capitalisation of all the shares on the stock exchange. Indeed, it is astonishing, she says, how quickly the benefits of curiosity-driven research sometimes appear. Second, no nation has unlimited funds, and it will have even less if it wastes them. So what projects to support? Politicians can't decide, and heaven knows it's difficult enough for own advisors to say yes or no to applications. I've always had a great sympathy for Max Perutz's view that we should be ready to support the teams, however small, which can demonstrate the intellectual flair and leadership which is driven by intense curiosity and dedication. She concluded, Mr. President, this country will be judged by its contribution to knowledge and its capacity to turn knowledge to advantage. It is only when industry and academia recognise and mobilise each other's strengths that the full intellectual energy of Britain will be released. And it's that speech that gives us the modern prominence of curiosity-driven research. The upswing is from 1988. Okay, I'm going to move to conclusion. So, curiosity-driven research. Well, it's remained prominent since 1988. In 1995, the Times had an editorial praising scientific curiosity. In 2008, Helga Novotny, the doyenne of European science policy, highlighted curiosity. In 2009, the Royal Society here launched a project called The Fruits of Curiosity, Baconian, right? Paul Nurse, president of the Royal Society back in 2014, said curiosity was the main impetus of research, adding that top-down direction on what science should be done is ineffective. That pairing of curiosity and autonomy is telling. The sociologist Jane Calvert, when interviewing scientists about the meaning of basic research, was struck by an apparent contradiction that took place with little cognitive dissonance. Scientists would say they were free to follow curiosity, but then say their funding sources necessarily directed them. But what have we learned? Now, if there's one thing we do know about curiosity, it's that curiosity killed the cat. Right? In fact, I did some investigation. The leading final cause of the death of Felis catus is euthanasia, 87%. It wasn't curiosity that killed the cat, it was the vet. Now, Peter Medawar, again in his advice to a young scientist, noticed that while curiosity might kill some cats, it also cured some. Curiosity cured the cat because veterinary medicine depends at some level on science and on curiosity-driven science. Well, that's a reminder that much of modern science is generated in response to the incessant articulation of problems, whether they be of human health, of armed conflict, of civil administration, of climate change, of the building of technological systems, or even the curing of cats. And that was the main conclusion of my book, Science in the 20th Century and Beyond. As an aside, science policy implications of such a conclusion are quite clear. You have to open up and make more democratic the processes by which problems are articulated. You have to support science, the resources for modelling those problems. You have to also open up and democratise the processes whereby solutions are deducted from the scientific research too. Science's utility is its greatest justification, but it's also a professional danger in the sense that if requests to solve problems are too overwhelming, then there's a threat to the autonomy of science, or that's the reason for the social organisation of autonomy, if you like. The invention of kinds of science, from basic science to mission-oriented science to curiosity-driven science, are tools, rhetorical tools that are created to create and manage that apparent social autonomy that is functional in sustaining science. The social contract has been, we will deliver if left autonomous. And curiosity-driven research is an interesting case. The association of curiosity with childhood, with its attendant connotations of innocence and vitality, which shows a recurrent pattern, is particularly effective at helping the social contract. If we think all children are naturally curious, then we think of curiosity as universal and as innate. But even the association of curiosity with childhood is actually surprisingly partial and political. Pollsters in the recent extraordinary American presidential election found that they could use the question, would you prefer your child to be curious or to show good manners, as an excellent predictor of voting intentions. Right? So it's not as simple. So what we've seen that curiosity's got a long and a short history. Early modern curiosity was deeply ambivalent. It could be a source of sin or virtue. Bacon and Baconianism, as institutionalised in the Royal Society, set it on the path to a universal positive. Even then, it was part of the rhetorical armoury of science. In the 20th century, curiosity has seemed an uncomplicated, desirable virtue. We saw scientific curiosity rise so high it was beatified, the holy curiosity of Einstein. This instance, where The Onion, good source, satirises a situation in which an MIT grad student puts 30% of the workforce out of a job by a small change in a robotics experiment done out of mere curiosity, is a very rare case where curiosity is negative. It's funny, of course, precisely because our expectations are that scientific curiosity is a good. Einstein said curiosity has its own reasons for existence, but the short history, the rise to prominence of curiosity-driven research since Margaret Thatcher's Royal Society speech of 1988, should remind us that it is a tool made and wielded for purposes in this world. Thank you. Thank you.